What would you do if death stared you in the face and you had seconds to choose between saving yourself or protecting innocent strangers? Most of us hope we'll never find out.
But for 28-year-old security officer Sarah Chen, that moment came on an ordinary Tuesday morning when she walked into what seemed like a routine day at the downtown Federal Building. What happened next would test every fiber of her being and reveal a kind of courage that most people only read about in history books.
This isn't just another survival story. This is about a woman who faced the ultimate test of character when terror struck, and how her split-second decisions created ripple effects that would inspire a nation and redefine what it truly means to be brave. Some heroes wear capes. Others wear security uniforms and carry the weight of impossible choices. Sarah's story will make you question everything you think you know about fear, duty, and what ordinary people are capable of when pushed to their absolute limits. Sarah Chen never thought much about being brave.
At 28, she worked as a security officer at the Robert F. Kennedy Federal Building in downtown Los Angeles.
Her days were filled with routine checks, scanning badges, and making sure visitors followed protocol. It was steady work that paid the bills and let her save money for the nursing degree she planned to pursue. Her parents had immigrated from Taiwan when she was 5, working multiple jobs to give their children opportunities they never had. Sarah understood sacrifice, but she never imagined she would soon face the kind that would test her very soul.
Tuesday morning started like any other. Sarah arrived at the Federal Building at 6:30, an hour before her official shift began. She liked the quiet moments before the building came alive, with government workers, contractors, and visitors. The security desk in the main lobby was her domain, positioned strategically to monitor everyone who entered through the metal detectors. Behind her sat a wall of surveillance monitors showing feeds from cameras throughout the 20-story building. The morning rush began around 7:30. Sarah knew many of the regular employees by name after 3 years on the job. There was Mrs. Rodriguez from the Social Security office on the 4th floor, always carrying her thermos of coffee and wearing a different colorful scarf each day. Tom from building maintenance would wave as he made his rounds, usually stopping to chat about his grandson's Little League games.
Dr. Peterson, a stern-looking man from the Department of Health, never spoke but always nodded politely as he showed his badge. Around 9:15, Sarah noticed 3 men approaching the security checkpoint. Something about them immediately caught her attention. They walked too purposefully, their eyes constantly scanning the lobby, rather than focusing ahead like most visitors.
All 3 wore heavy winter coats despite the mild California weather. The man in the center, tall with dark hair and intense eyes, kept his right hand inside his coat pocket.
Sarah's training kicked in. She had attended numerous security briefings about recognizing suspicious behavior.
The Department of Homeland Security had increased threat levels recently due to intelligence about potential domestic terrorism. But Sarah had never faced anything more dangerous than an occasional drunk visitor or someone trying to bring prohibited items through security.
As the 3 men reached the metal detector, the tall man in the center stepped forward. Instead of placing his belongings in the tray like everyone else, he looked directly at Sarah and said something that made her blood freeze.
"Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt. We have explosives."
Time seemed to slow down.
Sarah could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The lobby, which had been filled with the normal sounds of morning activity, suddenly felt electric with tension. Other visitors in line began to realize something was wrong. A woman near the elevator let out a small gasp. An elderly man dropped his briefcase. The tall man slowly opened his coat to reveal what looked like a vest with wires and small rectangular blocks attached to it. His 2 companions did the same. Sarah had seen enough training videos to recognize suicide vests when she saw them. Her mouth went dry, but her mind began working with startling clarity. Behind the security desk, Sarah had several options. There was a panic button that would immediately alert police and lock down the building. There was also a secondary alarm that would trigger evacuations on all floors. But both of these actions would take precious seconds, and she could see the lead terrorist's finger hovering near what appeared to be a detonator. What happened next would later be analyzed by security experts, law enforcement professionals, and psychologists studying human behavior under extreme stress. Instead of immediately hitting the panic button, Sarah did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She smiled. "Good morning," she said in the calmest voice she could manage. "How can I help you today?" The tall man seemed momentarily confused. He had obviously expected screaming, panic, or immediate resistance. Instead, he faced a young woman who appeared to be treating him like any other visitor. His momentary hesitation gave Sarah the opening she needed. While maintaining eye contact and keeping her voice steady, Sarah continued talking. "I see you're here for business today. Do you have identification or an appointment with someone in the building?" As she spoke, Her left hand slowly moved toward the panic button, while her right hand remained visible on the desk. The second terrorist, a shorter man with nervous energy, became agitated.
"Stop talking," he hissed. "We're not here for appointments."
Everyone needs to get on the ground now. But Sarah had achieved something crucial in those first 30 seconds. She had prevented immediate panic, bought herself time to assess the situation, and most importantly, she had positioned herself as someone in control rather than a victim.
This psychological advantage would prove vital in the hours ahead. The lobby now held about 20 people, including visitors, employees arriving for work, and building maintenance staff. Sarah realized that her next decisions would determine whether these people lived or died. The training she had received flashed through her mind, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of this responsibility. "I understand," Sarah said, slowly raising her hands. "Let me help coordinate this so nobody gets hurt." She looked around the lobby at the frightened faces.
Mrs. Rodriguez stood frozen near the elevators, her coffee thermos trembling in her hands. A young father with 2 small children visiting the immigration office looked terrified. The lead terrorist seemed to appreciate Sarah's cooperative tone. "Smart girl," he said. "You're going to help us make sure everyone follows instructions exactly." What the terrorists didn't know was that Sarah had already triggered the silent alarm with her foot under the desk. A signal was now being sent to the Los Angeles Police Department, the FBI, and building security headquarters. But she also knew that help would take time to arrive, and these men seemed prepared for a siege. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah began to understand the terrorists' plan. They weren't just planning to detonate their explosives immediately. They wanted to use the building and its occupants as leverage for something bigger. The tall man, who seemed to be their leader, kept checking his phone and looking toward the upper floors of the building. "How many people work in this building?" he asked Sarah. Sarah's mind raced. She knew there were over 800 employees across 20 floors, plus daily visitors. If she gave him accurate numbers, would it encourage him to take more hostages? If she lied and he found out, would it anger him enough to trigger the explosives? "It varies by day," she said truthfully. "Today seems lighter than usual." The leader nodded and whispered something to his companions. Then he made an announcement that chilled Sarah to her core. "Everyone in this lobby, listen carefully. We are going to move to the main conference room on the 15th floor. You will walk calmly to the elevators. Anyone who tries to run, hide, or alert others will cause everyone to die instantly." Sarah realized they were planning to take hostages to a more defensible position higher in the building. Once there, it would be much harder for law enforcement to reach them. She also knew that the 15th floor housed several high-level government offices, including federal prosecutors and Department of Justice personnel. As the group began moving toward the elevators, Sarah made another calculated decision. She stepped away from the security desk and positioned herself near the most vulnerable hostages, the elderly man who had dropped his briefcase, and the young family with children. "It's going to be okay," she whispered to the father. "Stay calm and follow their instructions exactly." The man nodded gratefully, clutching his daughter's hand tighter. His son, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, looked up at Sarah with wide, frightened eyes. In the elevator, packed with 20 hostages and 3 terrorists, Sarah found herself standing next to the leader. She could see the crude construction of his explosive vest up close. It was clearly homemade but appeared functional. More concerning, she noticed he had a secondary device in his hand that looked like a remote detonator. "What's your name?" he asked her quietly. "Sarah Chen." "You're being very smart about this, Sarah Chen. Keep everyone calm and cooperative, and maybe we all walk away from this." Sarah nodded, but she was already thinking several steps ahead. She had triggered the building alarm, which meant law enforcement was mobilizing. But she also knew that standard hostage situations could last for hours or even days. These people were depending on her to help them survive. As the elevator climbed toward the 15th floor, Sarah caught the eye of Mrs. Rodriguez, who looked like she might collapse from fear. Sarah gave her a small, reassuring nod. Then she looked at each of the other hostages, trying to communicate calm and control through her expression. When the elevator doors opened on the 15th floor, Sarah stepped out first, as instructed by the leader. The hallway was empty. Most employees hadn't yet arrived for work, and those who had were likely in their offices unaware of what was happening downstairs. The terrorists directed everyone toward a large conference room at the end of the hall. As they walked, Sarah noticed fire exits, emergency phones, and other details that might prove important later. She also realized that from this height, she could see police cars beginning to gather on the streets below. Inside the conference room, the hostages were ordered to sit on the floor, along the walls. The large windows offered a view of the city, but Sarah knew they also made everyone visible to potential law enforcement snipers positioned on nearby buildings. The leader positioned himself near the windows while his two companions guarded the doors. Then he made another announcement that revealed the true scope of their plan.
"We are not here to hurt innocent people," he said, "but we will if necessary.
This building houses prosecutors who have destroyed the lives of our brothers. We demand the release of 12 political prisoners currently being held in federal custody. We also demand safe passage out of the country." Sarah realized this was more sophisticated than a random attack.
These men had specific goals and had obviously planned their operation carefully. But she also sensed something else in the leader's voice: uncertainty.
He kept checking his phone as if waiting for instructions or confirmation from someone else. As the first hour passed, Sarah began to notice patterns in the terrorist's behavior. The nervous one kept pacing and checking the hallway. The third man, who had been mostly silent, appeared to be monitoring police radio frequencies on a small device. The leader remained calm but seemed increasingly frustrated with whoever he was trying to contact on his phone. Sarah realized that their plan might not be going as expected. This could make them more dangerous, but it might also create opportunities. She began to pay closer attention to their conversations, trying to gather intelligence that might prove useful. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of helicopters circling the building. The police presence was growing, but so was the tension inside the conference room. Some of the hostages were beginning to panic as the reality of their situation sank in. The young father was trying to keep his children quiet, but his 6-year-old son had started crying softly. The sound seemed to agitate the nervous terrorist, who snapped, "Make him stop." Sarah saw an opportunity to establish more trust with the leader while protecting the family.
"May I help?" she asked. "I'm good with children." The leader studied her for a moment, then nodded.
Sarah slowly moved to sit near the family. She began speaking softly to the little boy, telling him a story about a brave astronaut exploring space. Her calm voice seemed to help not just the child but several other hostages who had been on the verge of panic. As Sarah told her story, she was also observing everything around her. She noticed that the nervous terrorist kept looking at his watch and seemed increasingly agitated as time passed. The silent one monitoring the radio appeared concerned about something he was hearing. And the leader's phone calls were becoming more frequent and more heated. Something was going wrong with their plan, and Sarah sensed that the next few hours would determine whether everyone in that room lived or died. She continued her story about the brave astronaut, but her mind was working furiously, trying to find a way to save the 20 innocent people whose lives now depended on her ability to stay calm and think clearly under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The little boy had stopped crying and was listening intently to her story. "This is the biggest problem," his father mouthed thank you to Sarah. But she knew this was just the beginning. The real test of her courage was still to come. 3 hours into the hostage situation, the atmosphere in the conference room had become suffocating. Sarah could see the strain on everyone's faces. The elderly man who had dropped his briefcase earlier was having trouble breathing, and she worried he might be having a heart attack. Mrs. Rodriguez sat silently against the wall, tears streaming down her face. The young mother held her baby tightly while trying to comfort her 6-year-old son, who kept asking when they could go home. The leader, who had introduced himself only as Marcus, was becoming increasingly agitated. His phone conversations were growing more heated, and Sarah could hear fragments of arguments about timing and backup plans. The nervous terrorist, whom Marcus called Jake, paced constantly and kept checking the windows for signs of law enforcement activity. Sarah had been carefully observing their behavior patterns for hours. She noticed that Marcus checked his watch every few minutes and seemed to be working toward some kind of deadline. The third terrorist, a quiet man in his 40s whom they called Tony, monitored police communications and occasionally whispered updates to Marcus. Around noon, Tony's radio crackled with increased chatter. He listened intently, then whispered urgently to Marcus. Whatever he heard made Marcus's face darken with anger. "They're not taking us seriously," Marcus announced to the room. "The authorities think they can wait us out." Sarah felt the tension spike immediately. Several hostages started crying softly. She could see panic beginning to spread and knew she had to do something to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control.
"What do you need them to understand?" Sarah asked calmly. Marcus turned to her with surprise.
"What? You said they're not taking you seriously. What would convince them that your demands are legitimate?" Marcus studied her carefully. Over the past 3 hours, Sarah had proven herself to be cooperative and helpful in keeping the other hostages calm. He had begun to trust her more than the others.
"They need to see that we're willing to follow through," Marcus said darkly. Sarah's blood ran cold.
She understood what he was implying, but she kept her expression neutral. What would that accomplish? It would show them we're serious about our demands. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, buying time while her mind raced. But it would also change everything, wouldn't it? Right now, this is about political prisoners and safe passage. If someone gets hurt, it becomes about murder. The authorities would have to respond differently.
Marcus paused, clearly not expecting this line of reasoning from a hostage. You studied this, didn't you? Sarah continued.
You know how these situations typically end. The authorities are probably hoping to wear you down, make you tired, and more willing to negotiate. But if this escalates, they'll have no choice but to use force.
Jake, who had been listening to their conversation, became agitated. She's trying to manipulate you, he said. We need to show them we're serious. Sarah realized she was walking a dangerous line.
If she pushed too hard, she might provoke exactly the violence she was trying to prevent. But she could see that Marcus was genuinely conflicted about his next move.
I'm not trying to manipulate anyone, Sarah said quietly. I'm just thinking about what happens next.
You said you want safe passage out of the country. How does that work, if law enforcement decides you're too dangerous to negotiate with? Marcus was quiet for several long moments. Then his phone rang again. This time, his conversation was brief and ended with him cursing angrily.
They won't even talk to us, he told Jake and Tony. They want us to surrender unconditionally. Jake's nervousness turned to agitation.
I told you this wouldn't work. We should have stuck to the original plan.
What original plan? Marcus snapped.
You know what plan.
Sarah felt ice in her veins.
From their exchange, it sounded like there had been a debate about strategy before they entered the building. Marcus had apparently chosen the hostage route over something else, something that Jake thought would have been more effective.
Tony, who had been monitoring the radio, suddenly looked alarmed. They're moving, he announced.
I'm hearing chatter about tactical teams positioning around the building. The news sent a wave of terror through the hostages. Several people started crying openly.
The elderly man's breathing became more labored, and Sarah worried he might collapse. Everyone stay calm, Sarah said firmly, though her own heart was pounding.
She looked around the room at the frightened faces. These people were counting on her to help them survive. Marcus walked to the windows and peered down at the street. Even from the 15th floor, they could see the increased police presence. News vans had arrived, and crowds of curious onlookers were being held back by barriers.
This is taking too long, Jake said.
We need to do something to get their attention.
Like what? Marcus asked. Jake looked meaningfully at the hostages. Send them a message they can't ignore. Sarah knew she was witnessing the moment when everything could fall apart. Jake was advocating for violence, and Marcus was under pressure to act decisively.
The situation was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Wait, Sarah said, standing up slowly with her hands visible.
Before you make any decisions, can I ask you something? Marcus turned to her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. You said you're doing this for political prisoners, people you call your brothers. What happens to them if this goes wrong? If you hurt innocent people here, doesn't that make it harder for anyone to take their cases seriously? Jake scoffed, but Marcus seemed to consider her words.
I mean, Sarah continued, right now you're political activists taking a stand for what you believe in. That's how your brothers would want to be remembered, right? As people fighting for justice, not as terrorists who killed innocent families. She gestured toward the young parents with their children. That little boy over there will remember this day for the rest of his life.
What story do you want him to tell? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Sarah could see the internal struggle on his face. Then his phone rang again. This time the conversation was different. Marcus listened more than he spoke, and his expression grew increasingly troubled. When he hung up, he looked defeated. What is it? Tony asked. They arrested the others. Jake cursed.
What others? The team that was supposed to hit the courthouse simultaneously. They were taken down before they even got inside.
Sarah realized that this had been part of a larger coordinated attack. The hostage situation was supposed to be one part of multiple simultaneous operations. With the other teams captured, Marcus and his companions were now isolated and cut off from their support. So what do we do? Jake demanded. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Sarah could see him reassessing everything. The tactical situation had changed dramatically. Instead of being part of a larger operation, they were now alone, with no backup and no clear way out. The radio crackled with more police chatter. Tony listened intently, then paled. They're talking about bringing in federal hostage rescue teams, FBI tactical units. Sarah knew what that meant. The authorities were preparing for an assault. The window for peaceful resolution was closing rapidly. How long do we have?
Marcus asked.
Maybe an hour, Tony replied. They're evacuating nearby buildings and setting up perimeters. The hostages could hear some of this conversation and panic was spreading. The young mother was trying to muffle her baby's cries while her 6-year-old son asked repeatedly when they could go home.
Mrs. Rodriguez was praying softly in Spanish. Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her life.
She stood up again and addressed Marcus directly. You have a choice to make, she said. And it's not just about you anymore.
It's about everyone in this room, including your 2 friends. Marcus looked at her with surprise.
What do you mean? I mean that in about an hour, armed tactical teams are going to come through those doors. When they do, people are going to die.
Maybe all of us. Is that really what you want your brothers to be remembered for? Jake started to interrupt, but Marcus held up a hand to silence him.
Sarah continued. You came here to make a statement about injustice. You wanted people to pay attention to your cause. Well, the whole world is watching now. Every news station, every website. You have everyone's attention. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. The question is, what do you want to say to them? Do you want to be remembered as the people who stood up for their beliefs, or as the people who murdered innocent children? The room was completely silent, except for the distant sound of helicopters overhead. Sarah could feel everyone's eyes on her as she waited for Marcus's response.
Marcus looked around the room at the hostages.
His eyes lingered on the young family, the elderly man struggling to breathe, and Mrs. Rodriguez with her tears. Then he looked at Jake and Tony, his companions, who had followed him into the situation. There's another way, Sarah said softly. You can still make your statement. You can still draw attention to your cause. But you can do it without destroying lives. How? Marcus asked.
Let me help you negotiate a surrender that accomplishes what you came here to do. Jake exploded. Are you insane?
She's a security guard trying to save her own skin. But Marcus was studying Sarah's face intently. What are you talking about? Sarah took a deep breath. What she was about to propose was incredibly risky, but it might be the only way to save everyone in that room.
You want people to hear your message about political prisoners and government overreach.
What if we could arrange for you to deliver that message to the world before you surrender? They'll never agree to that, Tony said. They might, Sarah replied, if the alternative is a tactical assault that could result in multiple casualties and extensive property damage.
Marcus was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with the decision.
Sarah could see that he was torn between his desire to make a meaningful statement and his growing realization that their situation was hopeless. Finally, he spoke. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah felt a surge of hope. If Marcus was willing to listen, there might be a way out of this that didn't end in bloodshed. I'm proposing that we call the authorities and offer a deal, Sarah said. You release the hostages as a show of good faith, and in exchange, they give you a platform to explain your cause before you surrender. Jake shook his head violently. That's suicide. The moment we release the hostages, we lose all our leverage. What leverage do we have now? Sarah asked. The other teams are captured. Law enforcement is preparing to storm this building. Your only leverage is the threat to kill innocent people. Is that really the legacy you want? Marcus walked to the window again, looking down at the crowds below. Sarah could see news crews setting up, satellite trucks parking along the street. The whole world was indeed watching. When he turned back to the room, Sarah could see that something had changed in his expression. The desperate anger had been replaced by something else. Perhaps resignation, perhaps clarity. If we did this, Marcus said slowly, how would we know they wouldn't just arrest us the moment we let people go?
Because it would be broadcast live, Sarah replied.
With all those news crews down there, everything would be on camera. They couldn't go back on their word without the whole world seeing it. Marcus looked at his companions. Tony seemed troubled but thoughtful. Jake remained hostile to any suggestion of surrender. This is our only chance to make a real impact, Sarah continued. Right now, the story is about terrorists taking hostages, but if you release everyone safely and then explain your cause, the story becomes about the issues you're fighting for. She could see Marcus wavering. The next few minutes would determine whether this ended in tragedy or triumph. Think about those political prisoners you're trying to help, Sarah pressed. If you get yourself killed here, you can't fight for them anymore. But if you survive this, you can continue working for their freedom. Please say good sentences. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then he asked the question Sarah had been waiting for. How would we set this up? The next 30 minutes would become the most crucial half hour in Sarah Chen's life. After convincing Marcus to consider negotiating a peaceful resolution, she faced the enormous challenge of actually making it happen. The clock was ticking. with FBI tactical teams positioning around the building, and Jake becoming increasingly agitated about any plan that involved surrender. Sarah asked Marcus for permission to use the conference room's phone to contact the authorities. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed the number for building security, knowing it would be routed to the command post that law enforcement had established outside. "This is Sarah Chen, the security officer from the lobby," she said when someone answered. "I'm in the conference room, on the 15th floor, with the hostages and the 3 men who took control of the building." The voice on the other end was professional but tense. "Ms. Chen, this is FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres. Are you injured? Are the hostages safe?" Sarah looked around the room. Everyone was alive, though. The elderly man appeared to be having increasing difficulty breathing, and several people were clearly traumatized. "Everyone is physically unharmed, but we have a gentleman who may need medical attention soon. We are aware of the situation. Ms. Chen, are you able to speak freely?" Sarah glanced at Marcus, who was listening intently to her conversation. "Yes, the leader is allowing me to speak with you about finding a peaceful resolution." There was a pause on the line. "What kind of resolution?" "They want to make a public statement about their cause before surrendering. They're willing to release all hostages immediately in exchange for a guarantee of safe passage to deliver their message to the media." Agent Torres was quiet for several seconds. "Ms. Chen, I need to discuss this with my superiors. Can you give us 15 minutes? Sarah looked at Marcus, who nodded reluctantly. "We can wait 15 minutes, but the tactical situation here is deteriorating. Some of the hostages need medical attention, and emotions are running high." After hanging up, Sarah turned to address the entire room.
"They're going to consider the proposal," she announced. "Everyone just needs to stay calm for a few more minutes." Jake immediately erupted.
"This is insane. The moment we let them go, we're dead men. They'll have snipers waiting to take us down." Marcus seemed torn between Sarah's logical arguments and Jake's fears. "What if they're lying?" he asked Sarah. "What if they have no intention of honoring any agreement?" Sarah had been thinking about this exact concern. "That's why everything needs to happen in public view, with live television coverage. Once the cameras are rolling, they can't go back on their word without facing enormous public scrutiny." Tony, who had been monitoring police communications, looked up from his radio. "The FBI is pulling back their assault teams," he reported. "Sounds like they're considering the proposal." This news seemed to calm Marcus somewhat, but it had the opposite effect on Jake. "Don't you see what's happening? They're playing for time while they position themselves for a better attack angle." Sarah realized that Jake posed the biggest threat to a peaceful resolution. His paranoia and desperation were escalating, and she worried he might do something reckless that would destroy any chance of success. "Jake," Sarah said, addressing him directly for the first time, "can I ask you something?" He looked at her suspiciously. "What? What did you hope to accomplish when you came here this morning? What was the goal?" Jake seemed surprised by the question. "To get justice for our brothers who are rotting in federal prison for standing up for what's right. And how many people do you think will care about that justice if we all end up dead in this room?" Jake didn't answer, but Sarah could see her words were having an impact. "The way I see it," Sarah continued, "we have 2 choices. We can go down fighting and become a footnote in the news about a terrorist attack that killed innocent people. Or we can get out of this alive and spend the rest of our lives fighting for the cause you believe in." Marcus was nodding slowly. "She's right, Jake. Dead martyrs can't help anyone." The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Agent Torres was calling back with the FBI's response. "Miss Chen, we're willing to discuss the proposal, but we need some assurances. First, all hostages must be released before any public statement. Second, the 3 men must surrender their weapons and explosive devices before any media access is granted." Sarah looked at Marcus, who had been listening to the conversation on speakerphone. His face showed the internal struggle between hope and suspicion. "What guarantees do we have that you won't simply arrest us the moment we comply?" Marcus asked. "You have my word as a federal agent that if you release the hostages unharmed and surrender peacefully, you will be given the opportunity to make a brief public statement before being taken into custody." Jake laughed bitterly. Her word? That's what our lives are worth? But Sarah had an idea. "What if we modify the terms slightly?" she suggested. "What if one hostage is released first as a show of good faith, then the statement is arranged, and then the remaining hostages are released simultaneously with the surrender?" Agent Torres conferred with someone in the background before responding. "We could agree to that structure, but the statement would have to be brief and cannot include any threats or incitement to violence." Marcus looked around the room at the hostages, then at his 2 companions. Sarah could see him weighing the options. The alternative to negotiation was almost certainly death for everyone in the room. Which hostage would go first? Marcus asked.
Sarah looked around the room and made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. The elderly gentleman who's been having trouble breathing. He needs medical attention immediately. Marcus studied her face.
You could have suggested yourself. I'm not leaving until everyone else is safe. This statement seemed to crystallize something for Marcus.
Here was a woman who had spent the last 5 hours helping him navigate an impossible situation, and now she was refusing to take the first opportunity to save herself. Why? Marcus asked quietly. Sarah thought for a moment before answering. Because this is my job. Not just the security guard part, but the part where I help protect people. These folks are depending on me to see this through. Jake shook his head in disgust. You're all insane. But Tony was looking at Sarah with something approaching admiration. She's been straight with us this whole time, he told Marcus.
When she could have tried to trick us or fight us, she helped keep everyone calm instead. Marcus made his decision. Okay, we'll try it your way. The next 20 minutes were a carefully choreographed dance of trust and verification. Agent Torres arranged for a news crew to set up outside the building, with live coverage beginning immediately. The elderly hostage was released and taken directly to a waiting ambulance, confirming to everyone watching that the authorities were honoring their part of the agreement. With cameras rolling and the entire nation watching, Marcus was escorted to a position near the building's entrance, where he could address the media. Sarah watched from the conference room window as he spoke passionately about government overreach, political prisoners, and the need for justice reform. His statement lasted exactly 5 minutes as agreed. When he finished, he raised his hands and walked slowly toward the waiting federal agents. Jake and Tony, seeing that Marcus had kept his word and was being treated properly, agreed to follow the same protocol. One by one, they removed their explosive vests, placed them carefully on the ground, and surrendered. As the remaining hostages were evacuated from the building, Sarah found herself walking alongside Mrs. Rodriguez toward the elevators. The older woman grabbed her arm gently. Mija, she said, tears streaming down her face. You saved our lives in there. I just did what anyone would do. No, Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly. Anyone would have panicked. Anyone would have thought only of themselves. What you did in there was extraordinary. As they reached the lobby, Sarah could see news crews and cameras everywhere. Federal agents were waiting to debrief all the hostages. The young father whose children she had comforted came over to thank her, his voice breaking with emotion. My kids will grow up because of what you did today, he said. How do I ever repay that? Sarah didn't know what to say. She had never seen herself as a hero, just someone doing her job under extraordinary circumstances. But as she looked around at the faces of people who were alive because of her decisions, she began to understand the impact of her actions. Agent Torres approached her as the other hostages were being taken for medical evaluation and debriefing. Miss Chen, we're going to need to interview you extensively about what happened in there, but I wanted to tell you something first. Sarah waited. In 20 years with the FBI, I've never seen anything like what you accomplished today. You prevented a massacre through pure courage and intelligence. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the attention and praise. I was just trying to keep everyone alive. That's exactly what makes it remarkable, Agent Torres replied. When most people would have been paralyzed by fear, you found a way to de-escalate an impossible situation. Over the following weeks, as the full story emerged through investigations and media coverage, Sarah learned more about how close they had all come to disaster. The 3 terrorists had enough explosive materials to bring down a significant portion of the building. Jake had been advocating for detonating the bombs regardless of negotiations, and only Marcus's decision to trust Sarah's approach had prevented catastrophe. The political prisoners that Marcus had been fighting for became the subject of renewed public attention. Several cases were reviewed, and legitimate concerns about their treatment were addressed through proper legal channels. Marcus and his companions were sentenced to significant prison terms, but their non-violent surrender and the fact that no one was hurt were considered mitigating factors. Sarah returned to work 2 weeks after the incident, though her role had changed dramatically. She was promoted to head of security for the entire building complex and became a consultant for federal building security nationwide. More importantly, she enrolled in the nursing program she had been saving for, with her tuition paid by grateful donations from people who had followed the story. But the change that mattered most to Sarah wasn't professional or financial. It was the realization that she possessed a kind of courage she never knew she had. Not the absence of fear, but the ability to function effectively despite being terrified. 6 months later, Sarah received a letter from Marcus, written from federal prison. In it, He thanked her for giving him the chance to make his statement without bloodshed. He wrote that he had used his time in prison to study law and was working with advocacy groups to address criminal justice issues through legal means.
You showed me that there's a difference between fighting for justice and destroying innocent lives, he wrote. Thank you for helping me remember that.
Sarah kept the letter in her desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what she had learned that day.
Courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about caring enough about other people to act despite the fear. It was about finding ways to solve problems instead of creating bigger ones. And most importantly, it was about recognizing that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, are capable of extraordinary things.
The young father whose children she had helped comfort during those terrifying hours stayed in touch with Sarah. His son, who had been 6 years old during the incident, grew up telling people about the security guard who told him stories and kept him safe when he was scared. Years later, when he was applying to college, he wrote his admission essay about that day and about his decision to study conflict resolution because of what he had witnessed.
Mrs. Rodriguez, the woman with the colorful scarves who brought coffee to work each morning, retired 2 years after the incident.
At her retirement party, she gave Sarah a gift, a handmade scarf in bright blues and greens.
"For the angel who saved us," she said. Sarah protested that she wasn't an angel, just a person who did her job. "Exactly," Mrs. Rodriguez replied. "That's what made you an angel." Years later, when Sarah had become a registered nurse and was working in a hospital emergency room, she would often think about that day.
The skills she had learned, staying calm under pressure, thinking clearly in crisis situations, and helping people through their worst moments, served her well in her new career. But more than the professional skills, that day had taught her something fundamental about human nature. When faced with impossible choices, people reveal who they truly are. Some choose fear and violence. Others choose hope and courage. Sarah had learned that she was someone who chose courage, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she cared more about others than she feared for herself.
The federal building where it all happened now has a small plaque in the lobby next to the security desk where Sarah once worked. It reads, "In recognition of all those who choose courage in the face of fear, and who remind us that heroes are not born but revealed in moments of crisis." Sarah rarely visited the building anymore, but when she did, she would sometimes stop and read the plaque.
It never mentioned her by name, which was exactly how she preferred it. The real heroes, she believed, were all the ordinary people who faced that terrifying day and chose to trust each other, to stay calm, and to believe that there was a way through the darkness. That was the lesson Sarah carried with her for the rest of her life. True courage isn't about facing danger without fear. It's about facing danger and choosing to protect others despite the fear. It's about finding hope in hopeless situations and building bridges instead of walls. And most importantly, it's about remembering that in our worst moments, we have the choice to bring out either the best or the worst in ourselves and others. Sarah Chen chose to bring out the best. And because of that choice, 20 people went home to their families that day. 3 men found a path away from violence, and the world learned once again that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary acts of courage when they choose love over fear.